Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kata Bailin, Faculty Director of LASIS at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have the honor to welcome all of you to today's panel, part of our migration webinar series that UW-Madison organized together with the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Today's panel focused on providing legal services to women and children seeking asylum in detention, has been prepared and is going to be moderated by Erin Barbato. And Erin is the director of Immigrant Justice Clinic at the University of Wisconsin Law School. She teaches second and third year law students to represent individuals in removal proceedings and those seeking humanitarian-based immigration relief. She also leads groups of law students to volunteer at detention centers close to our southern border and to work with people seeking asylum forced to remain in Mexico. So I wanted to say thank you to all the students who will be participating in today's panel, who came to join us to share their experiences from South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas. I wanted to say thank you to Erin Barbato for preparing the panel, to all the people in the public who came to join us during such a beautiful afternoon. I wanted to say thank you, as usual, to LASIS Organizational Committee, to Iris, to LASIS team, to CLACS from University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, especially to Jolie Klein and Natasha Borges. And before I pass the voice to Erin, who is going to introduce speakers and start our panel today, I just wanted to ask everyone to fill the post-webinar evaluation, which you will receive through Zoom. We will be very grateful if you do. It's going to be very helpful for us in terms of preparing continued programming for you in future. So thank you very much again to everyone, and let's start. Erin.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Kata. I want to thank everybody who is joining us today. This is a really challenging time for so many people, and with everything going on in the news right now, I worry that the people who are seeking asylum, and especially the people in detention in our country, are somewhat being forgotten. And so I'm hoping that today we can just share some information with everybody and learn from my students and what they, the work that they do, because it's really incredibly powerful, but also learn about what our country is doing to people who are seeking refuge in the United States. So I am going to share my screen and go through a few slides. I'm going to introduce a little information about the detention system, the immigration detention system in the United States, and then I'm going to pass it along to some of my former students who are now attorneys, and they will be sharing a little bit more information about you, about the laws and policies, and then we are going to open it up to a discussion with a broader group of students. So I'm going to share my screen now. I hope it works. Oh, the host says I'm disabled from sharing my screen. Can anybody help me with that? Anyone? Kata, do you know how I can?
And we need M for that.
Okay.
M, are you there? M?
Yeah.
Could you help Erin to show her, share her screen? She's
Absolutely.
not able to share her screen.
Thank you.
There you go. You should be able to now.
Great, thank you so much.
Of course.
I don't want anyone to miss out on my exciting slides. So, okay. So I'm hoping everybody can see this now. And okay, so today we'll be talking about the legal representation of women and children who are seeking asylum that are detained in the United States. I work at the Immigrant Justice Clinic. I'm the director of that, as Kata mentioned, and we work closely with the Latinx Law Student Association. So both my program and the volunteer experiential learning trips that we do to the border are all student started programs. So students at the University of Wisconsin Law School they saw a need for more immigrant representation for people in immigration proceedings in Wisconsin, as well as a need to serve people closer to the border in detention. And so through their efforts, we have been able to have programs here on campus, as well as programs that travel to the border during summer break and in winter break as well. But so what we'll cover today is I'm going to go over a little bit about what civil detention of immigrants is in the United States. And then after I'm done talking, you're going to hear from the more exciting people, current former students and current students who have on-the-ground experience working in these areas. So Julia Jago is going to talk about seeking asylum in the United States. What is the law? What does it say? And then Angela O'Brien is going to talk about the credible fear and reasonable fear interviews, as well as the safe third country transit ban. And then Perla Rubio Terrones, she's going to talk about more of the on-the-ground experience that the students have when we go down to Dilley, Texas. And then we'll open it up to questions to the panel and to questions that some of you may have for us. So this is just a map of, it shows where ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement detention centers are located in the United States. You can see that the bluish green color are county or city facilities. And then the red ones, you might ask, what are those? Well, they're privately operated facilities. That means that we pay private corporations, our government being we, to run immigrant detention facilities. And one of those is the one in Dilley, Texas, the South Texas Family Residential Center, where we volunteer. But as you can notice, there are a number of these facilities across the country. These are for people who are in civil detention. They're not criminal detention, but civil detention. You can see from this graph the dramatic increase in the number of people that our country detains in the United States in civil immigrant detention. So in 1994, it was about 7,000 people. And now we're looking at a daily average now of over 45,000 people. It's a huge change over a short amount of time. And here's an even closer look, as we can see from October of 2018 until February of this year, we had an average, probably even closer to 50,000 people. That is the population of Annapolis, Maryland, Brookfield, Wisconsin, Wausau, Wisconsin. It's a huge number of people. And we can also see that over the past, since 2000, from 2000 to 2015, we deported more individuals or people from the United States than the entire 150 years prior. So this is a large effort by our government to detain and deport people from the United States. So how many people are currently in immigration proceedings? So right now, it's actually, we have about 20,000 people detained. And some people may say, well, that's great. We're decreasing the number of immigrants we're detaining in our immigrant detention facilities. But that's not really the case, because right now because of COVID, we've closed our southern borders and also have turned asylum seekers away. So we are no longer detaining people or letting people into the United States to seek this relief from removal or relief from persecution in their home countries. So right now the number is lower, but it's not because we are trying to, not because there's a less of a need for asylum or because we're treating people more humanely. It's just because of COVID. So what is civil detention? So I mentioned civil detention because it's different than when people serve a criminal sentence in jail. So Immigration proceedings are civil in nature and not criminal. However, our ICE detention facilities are really built on a correctional model. ICE maintains a network of beds in approximately 200 facilities across the country. We have more detention facilities and detain more people than any other country in the world. These detention facilities include the facilities run by ICE, then those run by private prison companies, and then also ones that are dedicated space within county and city and state jails. And then we ask, like, who is in immigrant detention? Who is being detained there? It can be non-citizens awaiting decisions in their removal cases, individuals who overstayed their visas and now are facing deportation or removal from the United States, people who recently crossed the southern border, or sometimes the northern border, much less likely, and are placed in detention. Sometimes lawful permanent residents who have been convicted of crimes, they will be detained in immigrant detention. And then individuals targeted through workplace raids as well. And what we'll concentrate on now today more is this asylum seekers fleeing persecution in their home countries, because those are the women and children that we worked with. So we detain adults, we detain families, we even detain children in this civil immigrant detention. There's limited access to legal representation, and this is incredibly important for a number of reasons. But deportation cases are the only legal proceedings in the United States in which people are routinely detained by federal government and are required to litigate for their liberty against trained government attorneys without the assistance of counsel. My daughter saw this picture and she asked me what it meant, and I just said, that's unfair, you know, the balancing of the scale. And really it is unfair for people who are facing removal and don't have representation. So civil proceedings, and why this is different is because criminal proceedings in our country, you are guaranteed an attorney if you can't afford one. But in civil proceedings, in immigration, you're not guaranteed an attorney if you cannot afford one. If you can afford one and you can hire an attorney to represent you, you can have one represent you in court. Or if you can find a pro bono attorney, you can have them represent you in court. But it's very difficult. Private bar attorneys are very expensive. And when you're in detention, you can't work. And pro bono attorneys are hard to come by, especially in these clandestine locations where many of these detention facilities are located. So if someone is represented by an attorney in immigration proceedings, this is why it's so important. They're 5 times more likely to receive the relief that they are seeking in immigration court. So if someone's non-detained, not in a detention center, and they're seeking asylum, and they have representation by an attorney, they're 5 times more likely to not be deported to the country where they fear persecution. And if they're detained, 2 times as likely to be successful in their application for relief from deportation. So it's incredibly important, and this can be life and death for many people. So we do have one civil detention center in Wisconsin right now. We used to have 2. One was in Kenosha, Wisconsin, but that was closed recently when Kenosha, the jail there, did not want to take in additional people during COVID, and then ICE terminated their contract. But they do still have, ICE still has a contract with Dodge County Correctional Facility in Dodge County, Wisconsin, where they have about 200 beds. These are not family detention centers, but these are places where single men or single women will be detained. That doesn't mean they're not married or they don't have families, but they will be detained separated from their families. This is the detention center that my students and I serve, and we visit there once a month, or right now we're providing Know Your Rights telephonically. But family detention is very different, and there are 3 family detention centers, and our government calls these residential facilities, but really what they are detention facilities. There is no freedom of movement through a detention facility or freedom to leave the detention facility. So the 3 family detention centers one is in Karnes County Residential Center, and it has about 530 beds, and that might be lower right now, but South Texas Family Residential Center, where we volunteered, has space for 2,400 women and children. That's the largest facility currently in the United States. And then there's also Berks County, Pennsylvania. The facility there has 90 beds. ICE has plans to expand family detention in Carnes, as well as recently extended a contract in Dilley until at least 2021. ICE has also requested an increase to $3.1 billion to increase their detention facilities across the United States. So I mentioned that some of these facilities are private, including run by private corporations, including the South Texas Family Residential Center where we volunteered. That is run by Core Civic, and Carnes is operated by Geo Corporation. So these are both billion-dollar corporations that are funded by our tax dollars to detain people who are seeking refuge in our country. Just a little more information about the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas. It's about an hour from San Antonio, Texas, and about an hour and a half from Laredo, which is on the US border with Mexico. It's been in operation since 2014, so it was started under the Obama administration. Prior to that, in 2009, we decreased as a country. We basically only had the Berks facility in Pennsylvania that was open for about 5 years. But in 2014, the Obama administration did open up this South Texas Family Residential Facility, and it only has been in operation since then and continues to operate to this day. And it has a capacity, as I said, to hold 2,400 women and children. That includes babies and what are called tender age children. Those are children that are under the age of 7. The cost of immigration detention is pretty astounding. So an adult in immigration detention is about $161 per person a day, and in family detention, $266 per day. We now spend about $2 billion in immigration detention, including family detention, but also not family detention. And then again, this administration is seeking an increase to $3.1 billion for this coming year, and an increase to 60,000 beds in the United States. These are all taxpayer dollars. You may have heard of the Flores settlement, which was from 1997, and it was in response to a detention facility in Texas, Hutto, closer to Austin. But what this Flores settlement said, it was an agreement between the government and advocates. It said that children must be placed in the least restrictive setting, children must be released from detention within 20 days, and government must implement standards for the care and treatment of children. Since 1997, compliance with these standards have been minimal. Most of the families that we work with that are detained at the South Texas Family Residential Center have been there longer than 20 days. And let's see. ICE detention is dangerous, and that's just kind of how I want to close this before I turn it over to Julia. But ICE has the authority to parole people out of detention or to offer bond to some individuals. So this is all a choice that ICE is making. ICE is not required to detain these human beings in detention, these children, these women, these people who are seeking refuge or protection in our country. They have the ability to do so. Even during COVID, they have the ability to parole people to go live with their family members and be in a safe environment. At least 20 adults have died in immigration detention this year, most of them due to COVID. And many of them had options of being able to leave the detention facility, but ICE would not let them. ICE, as we learned recently, ICE has retaliated against immigrants and denied adequate health care to individuals who are detained. We've also heard of the whistleblower allegations of medical neglect and questionable hysterectomies on ICE detainees. And then just yesterday, we confirmed that the administration, during family separation, they said we need to take away children. This was to deter people from coming to the United States. So all of these actions of detention and detaining women and children are to deter people from seeking asylum in the United States. And so it's not really a surprise that the facility is not comfortable and it's not safe. It's not meant to be. even though these people are allowed under our laws to seek refuge. And we at this time are trying to deter them from doing that. And I say that because this is why the work that these students do here in Wisconsin, but also, and many of them are attorneys now, but also on the border is so important, because they bear witness to what is going on and provide the necessary legal representation and information to people that very much need it while their lives may be in danger in detention facilities that our tax dollars pay for. So I'm going to now turn it over to Julia and stop sharing my screen, and hopefully she can share her screen.
All right, thanks, Erin. Let's see. PowerPoint. Sorry, one second. Okay, can we all see my screen? Great, that is wonderful news. So I'm now going to talk about the path to asylum and what that looks like for individuals who are seeking protection from the United States. As Erin mentioned, my name is Julia Jago. I just graduated in May from UW Law School, and I'm now an attorney at Boardman and Clark Law Firm in Madison. And I was in the clinic under Erin when I was a law student, which was feels so long ago, but was so short ago. And so I'm excited today to be talking to you guys again about asylum. So we'll start with talking about the international protections for asylum seekers. So in 1951, the United Nations had a refugee convention where they established the legal framework for protecting refugees escaping persecution in their home countries. So there's an international right to protection for those who are afraid to be in their home countries. Then in 1980, the United States codified their commitment to refugees and asylum seekers by passing the Refugee Act of 1980. And so that act created a whole system for admitting individuals into the United States as refugees or as asylum seekers. Sorry about my cat, she is crazy. And so essentially, that Refugee Act of 1980 made it so that it is legal to seek asylum. And I think it's important to point that out, that it is a legal right that people have to ask for asylum, and it is not violating the law to do so. So now we want to know who today can seek asylum. So basically, the general bar is that persons who have suffered persecution or fear persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group can seek asylum. And so let me break this down for you a little bit, what this means. So in order to ask for asylum, you have to have either suffered persecution in the past, and persecution is defined as a harm of a serious nature. That can be something physical, or that can be something that's not physical, such as for example, if a government won't allow you to practice your religion, that could be a non-physical form of persecution. And so you either have to have suffered this persecution in the past, or you have to have a reasonable fear of persecution in the future. And the persecution can't just be because of anything. Instead, there are specific categories that you have to fit in of the type of persecution that you suffered in order to be eligible for asylum. And those categories are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Beyond that, you have to be able to show that either the government was the one who was persecuting you, the government of your home country, or that a person who the government was unable or unwilling to control was persecuting you. So this is a pretty high bar already, and it's difficult for people to show this, but not impossible. Furthermore, you have to show that it was not reasonable for you to relocate within your home country. For example, if someone wasn't letting you practice your religion in a certain state, you need to be able to show that it wasn't reasonable for you to move to another state and then be able to practice your religion. And you also cannot have firmly resettled in another country. So that means that if you went and moved to Canada for 10 years and became a permanent resident there, you couldn't then come to the United States and say, oh, I need asylum because of something that happened to me 11 years ago when I fled my country for Canada. And then beyond that, you also cannot be subject to a bar to eligibility. And so this includes various things, but basically kind of captures the idea of you cannot apply for asylum if you have persecuted someone else or if you're a terrorist, essentially. And so beyond that, anybody can apply for asylum. It does not matter what country you are from. It's not limited to specific parts of the world. It doesn't matter if you entered the United States legally or illegally, regardless, there's a right to asylum. And so for that, and why asylum is so important, is that it confers really, really big benefits on people who are able to get asylum. This includes the authorization to work, which can have huge economic consequences and completely change someone's life if they're able to get a work permit or not. It allows you to get a green card after 1 year of having asylum status. And then 5 years after having your green card, you can apply to be a citizen. And so also if you're granted asylum, you can bring your spouse and your unmarried children with you who are under the age of 21, which is another large benefit of asylum. And then later on, if you become a green card holder or a citizen, you may be able to petition for other family members as well. So you might want to ask, you may be asking, like, why do people seek asylum? What is the impetus there to flee your home country and come to the United States seeking asylum? So there's a lot of answers to that question. I would say every single case has a different answer to that question, right? Because every person has their own individual experiences and their own reasons why they needed to leave their home country in order to come to a place to seek protection. But when we were at the South Texas Residential Center, I think that's how you say the name, or in Dilley, as we like to call it, we mostly saw women and children from Central America who are primarily fleeing either Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala for two big reasons. One was gang violence, and the other one was domestic violence. So first, I'll talk about gang violence and how that's a motivator to leave your country if you are experiencing that. So back in the early 2000s, the United States had this act called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of, well, actually it was in 1996, not early 2000s, but it led to deportation of lots and lots of people who had criminal convictions then later on in the following years. And so a lot of these people who had criminal convictions had ties to gangs that started in the United States, but then as they were deported, the gang culture kind of spread throughout the countries that they were deported to. And so that mixed with a really difficult situation in many of these countries at that time, after having gone through civil wars, there being a lot of poverty, there being a lot of young people whose families had recently undergone serious trauma because of the wars, because of poverty, et cetera, that led to expansion of gangs like Mara Salvatrucha, which is also known as MS-13, and the 18th Street Gang, also known as Barrio 18. And so this kind of created this whole new monster of gang activity and gang violence in Central America. And so now a lot of these gangs are still very much so present, even if they started perhaps in the early 2000s. And they also perpetuate violence against people who are unwilling to join the gang. If a gang has kind of labeled someone as a potential gang member and that person rejects the nomination, you could say, then oftentimes the gangs will retaliate against that person and perpetuate violence against them and their families. Also, there's going to be violence against rival gangs and rival gang families members. And beyond that, a lot of these gangs have a pretty strong hold in different communities. And it completely depends on the community, but in different communities, some of them have very strong holds. So for example, they may charge like rent, which is essentially extorting the members of a village, saying, you must pay me X amount of dollars or whatever the currency there happens to be per month. And if not, then we are going to, you know, come and burn your house down or something like that. I remember one story. There was one woman that I spoke with while we were at Dilley, and she was like a representative for a company like kind of like Mary Kay or Cutco, for example. And so as part of her job is she went to different neighborhoods and she would knock on people's doors and try and sell, you know, her products. I can't remember exactly what the product was. And she eventually, the gangs kind of caught on to the fact that she was going in and out of different neighborhoods every day, and they decided to start charging her specifically rents to say, if we catch you in this neighborhood, you know, you need to have paid us X amount of dollars, otherwise, you know, who knows what'll happen to you. And so after having herself experience violence because of that and having her family members threatened, she knew that she wasn't safe anymore in her hometown and that she couldn't stay there because these gangs were going to eventually, you know, harm her if she didn't meet their demands, and she needed to be safe. So that's one of the reasons why people seek asylum, and a lot of the women we saw seeking asylum in Dilley was one of the reasons that they had as well, was to escape gang violence. And then the other one is gender motivated violence is another thing that will drive people to seek asylum. So in Central America, there is a high incidence of gender motivated violence, and the prosecution rate for such violence is very, very low. Particularly violence against women is a very serious problem, and it leaves women to be left with no choice but to leave their hometown, leave their country in order to save their lives and their children's lives. Some horrifying statistics are that the female homicide rates in Central America are significantly higher than the global average. In El Salvador, the rate is 6 times above the global average, and in Honduras, the rate is 12 times the global average. And so not only could it be intimate partner violence, but as I mentioned, this could also deal with the intersection of gang violence as well, and violence that's perpetuated against women from gangs. And so, you know, there were a lot of women that we talked to in Dilley who had been the victims of domestic violence for many years, and eventually they got to a point where they said, hey, I am legitimately fearing for my life. I don't know if I can stay here. I don't know if I can keep my children here, and I need to escape. I need to be free of, you know, their aggressor. And so these are some of the reasons why people are seeking asylum and what we saw in Dilley. Unfortunately, the United States always likes to make things more difficult for people seeking asylum. And so in 2018, Jeff Sessions issued a decision that would make it more difficult for women to ask for asylum protection in the United States based on gender motivated violence, and for people to ask for protection based on gang violence. And so this has since been litigated. It's all a bit in flux, but just to go to show that even though there are very real and very real reasons that people are fleeing their countries and seeking asylum, doesn't always mean that our country is going to look on that as a, you know, sufficient to get asylum and to be eligible for asylum here. So I'll just touch really quick on the journey that people go through to get to the US border to ask for asylum. So oftentimes people are starting in, especially the women we talk to, they're starting in Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador, and they will travel through Mexico, you know, either on bus, by train, a combination of the two, and that's a pretty lengthy journey. And we talked to many women who had experienced violence against them while they were traveling through Mexico, a few who had been robbed or sexually assaulted along the way. And then you will arrive at the port of entry, you arrive at the border of the United States, right? And the idea there is that in theory, you could just go up to a port of entry, you know, knock on the door and say, hello, help me, please give me asylum. But as I believe Angela is going to talk about soon with the third country bar, I think Angela's talking about that, that's become more and more difficult. And so now, especially, we talked with a lot of women who intentionally crossed the border illegally, but with hopes of honestly being caught by CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, because they couldn't present themselves at a port of entry. So oftentimes, you know, someone might be hopping around between different ports of entry, trying to say, please let me in, only to go to 2 or 3 and then need to cross through the desert or cross through cross the river to get into the United States. and then they would be apprehended by Customs and Border Patrol soon after crossing. And because they crossed within 100 miles of the border, they would be subject to expedited removal. So this picture on the left shows where the ports of entry are in the entire United States. You can see that every state has at least one port of entry. And there's also this rule that says that if you are within 100 miles of the borders of the United States, then you can be subject to expedited removal instead of a full judicial process to determine whether or not you can be in the country legally. So this means that these women could, in theory, be deported immediately without having the opportunity to argue their case in front of an immigration judge. But the way to stop this process and press pause on expedited removal is to invoke asylum and say that you are afraid to return back to your home country, which then triggers this whole credible fear interview process to assess that fear while your expedited removal is paused. And I believe Angela will also be talking about this in just a few moments. So the families that we were seeing in Dilley arrived at the detention center after this whole state of events, right? They had traveled through Mexico, they had presented themselves at the border, they may have experienced harm against themselves in Mexico, they may have crossed the border legally, or they may have been able to cross the border legally and then were put into a detention facility. But either way, they came to us within days of crossing the border and going through all of these very traumatic things, and they were awaiting these interviews to assess whether or not their fear was to a high enough level that the United States might consider them eligible for asylum. So that is my section here, and I will now pass it off to Angela. Let me figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and bear with me while I try and share my screen. Is it working okay? Everyone can see that? Okay. So like Julia said, my name is Angela O'Brien. I was also in the Immigrant Justice Clinic with Perla and with Julia. Also, I'm a recent law school graduate. I was hired by the law firm of Quarles and Brady. But before law school, I spent a year on the US-Mexico border in El Paso doing the same type of work, working with women, children, other people who recently crossed the border and were trying to figure out all of the rapid changes that we've seen from pretty much 2014 onwards and how people have been treated, men, women, and children who've come across the border either together or alone. So as Julia mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on that process of when someone steps their first foot across the border, what happens to them, why it was set up this way, and more importantly, how that process can be used in order to further narrow and restrict asylum eligibility far away from the eyes of any type of due process, most types of legal representation. And so this is sort of the mechanism of how for all of the ideas and strategies that the current administration has for restricting asylum to people mainly from Mexico and from Central America. So I thought it would be easiest to talk about some of these concepts by using an example. So this example is entirely fictitious, including names and details, but it is very representative of many of the stories of women that we worked with and their children when we were in Dilley. So the person sort of created for this exercise, her name is Ana Maria. She's 25 years old, from El Salvador. She's single and has 2 babies, Jorge and Rosa, ages 3 and 5. And like Erin described, when we talk about these family detention centers, all of them are detained together, mom and kiddos, in these privately run civil detention centers that are basically jails. So if you can imagine, being in such a place with small children and having to deal with all of the complications of that as well, and then coming to people like us and trying to work on the mechanics and specifics of their legal cases. So here is the basics of sort of the story that I've created for this example. Again, very representative of the facts that we saw every day while we were there. So Anna Maria, typical lunch vendor, like Julia described, someone who goes around from place to place, selling food, selling items. A lot of Central American countries and South American countries really rely on informal economies in that way, of people selling what they can to make a living. So as Julia described, MS-13 and other gangs are extremely prevalent in the Northern Triangle, which are the countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Most of the women that we worked with in Dilley were from one of those three countries. So one day, young tattooed men began arriving in Ana Maria's village, claiming they work with MS-13. They approach her and tell her that she needs to start paying a war tax in order to keep the village safe, just like Julia described. Logically, Ana Maria refuses to pay because she barely has enough to get on with as it is. And the young man member tells her that his boss wants her to be his woman because he thinks that her, quote, honey-colored skin is beautiful, and says that if she doesn't pay the money, she will have to go and be this gang member's woman, his property in a way. So being fearful for herself and her safety and the safety of her children, Ana Maria takes her children and flees on foot and by bus to the United States to seek asylum. Important, as we'll see along this, for her claim of asylum. So just like Julia described, unfortunately, how things work in the United States, not everybody who's afraid for their life, for their children's life, can get asylum in the United States. You need to connect your fear of what's going to happen to you with a legally protected reason. So I tried to pick facts that would try and meet the minimum of that threshold in order to better illustrate the types of cases that might get asylum versus not get asylum. So that's the basics of her story. Again, very representative of many, many women and children that we worked with in Dilley. So Julia sort of showed the journey to the United States, but I'm showing it again in order to talk more specifically later about the impact of the third country transit ban. So I don't know, can you see my mouse on your guys' screen as well? So El Salvador is this tiny nation down here. I kind of outlined the borders in red so that you could better see them. So the typical route, you know, and again, the route isn't necessarily is the fastest from point A to point B, but for our purposes, anyone coming from El Salvador would have to cross into Guatemala. Sometimes they go up into Honduras and then across to Guatemala and then up through all of Mexico. And remember, it's every time that you cross into another country, asylum seekers are dealing with that country's immigration and control systems, their own systems of trying to deport people and send them back. So this is the typical journey that many women make. Sometimes they're lucky and can buy bus tickets that get them there safely. Other times they have to pay lots of money to smugglers and other, you know, disreputable people who make their money in their business and in dealing with and transacting people. So it can be a dangerous journey, but that is the path that many people take, and their ultimate goal is the United States. Because, like I've described, these three countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, are called the Northern Triangle, and all three countries have the same problems with the same gangs and the same situation, as does most of Mexico, although the criminal actors in Mexico might be slightly different. So that's why people come to the United States instead of stopping in any of these neighboring countries to try and see if they can make a living there if they can't live in their main country. So like Julia described, in 1996, Congress passed a law called IRA, the Immigrant and Reform and Responsibility, some crazy acronym. But that law was passed. It was a bipartisan law signed by Bill Clinton, President Clinton at the time, who was a Democrat, because Bill Clinton wanted to show that Democrats at the time were tough on crime. So like Julia already explained, that 1996 law expanded the categories of people who could be deported. It put a whole bunch of criminal convictions on the list now that were deportable offenses. And it also created, most significantly, this process of expedited removal, like Julia described, which is if you show up at a port of entry or if you cross without inspection between ports of entry, or if you're found within a 100-mile radius of the border and you can't prove that you've been in the United States for a predetermined length of time, you are expeditiously removed. That means immediately sent back to your country, no hearing, no judge, and most likely no lawyer to help you and see what your options are. So that's obviously a problematic procedure because we don't want to send asylum seekers back to places where they fear, further death, harm, persecution, or suffering for obvious reasons. And so when Congress enacted this law, they created a little bit of an escape valve called the credible fear interview. And so the idea of this credible fear interview, or CFI, was to say, okay, we're going to expedite, remove a large chunk of recent arrivals, but we need to make sure that we're protecting asylum seekers. So we're going to open a small door into a waiting room of people seeking asylum in this country. So it was an attempt to weed out any fraudulent asylum claims at the time. So in order to do that, in order to just pass the credible fear interview, the standard is incredibly low. All you have to prove is that there's a significant possibility, taking into account credibility and country conditions, that somewhere later on in the future, the asylum seeker could apply for and receive asylum on the merits from an immigration judge. So if you think about the credible fear interview as a door, and if you think of sort of the waiting time process as the waiting room, Dilley was like the waiting room, where you were trying to decide, do you have enough of the basics, of the bare minimum? Are you credible? Is your story significantly likely to win asylum later on? So the credible fear interview was not an asylum interview, technically. It was a way for women to show that they had the basics to check the boxes, so that later, when they moved on in the immigration system, they could eventually win asylum and meet all of the requirements that are necessary for that. So any woman or child or person who arrives at a port of entry and seeks asylum nowadays is subject to this credible fear interview process, which basically means if they don't show that significant possibility that they can show likelihood of their claim, they're subject to expedited removal and will be sent back to their country without a hearing. So the credible fear interview is incredibly important because it allows people that first door to pass through in order to stay in the United States and fight their asylum claims. So related to the CFI is a different type of interview called a reasonable fear interview. Most likely, this is seen for an asylum seeker who maybe came to the United States previously and was previously deported. The reasonable fear interview serves the same purpose as a credible fear interview, but the standard is just a little bit higher. Instead of a significant possibility, which is again that very small chance, checking the boxes that you need to show a reasonable possibility that you would be persecuted or tortured if returned home. So the only difference between a CFI and an RFI is that an RFI is a little bit harder to get and is reserved for asylum seekers who've either been deported in the past or who have, in certain cases, very serious criminal convictions. So many of the women that we dealt with in Dilley and that we worked with were undergoing credible fear interviews. And reasonable fear interviews were a little more rare, but usually a little more serious just because of the circumstances of those women. But whether it was CFI or RFI, the main purpose of these interviews is to have the women sit down with an asylum officer, and so the asylum officer can see, is there enough here of your claim that later on an immigration judge is likely to grant that relief. So like I said, the bar for a CFI is supposed to be very, very low to clear. Like Julia already described, in order to receive asylum outright, an applicant generally needs to show, among some other things, that there is a 1 in 10 chance they will be persecuted or harmed on account of a protected ground, which is the race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or being part of a particular social group, which basically means that you're part of a group that can be defined and you have the same fear of the same person or persons for the same reason. So if you can't connect it to one of those things, you can't get asylum in the United States. So basically what the CFI does is it's supposed to determine if there's a significant possibility that an applicant can at some point in the future show that there's a 1 in 10 chance that she will be harmed or persecuted. So you can see the pull quote that I pulled from former Republican Senator Orrin Hatch, that this was supposed to be a low screening standard. So the purpose of the CFI was just to interview everybody coming in order to weed out claims of people who may not truly be seeking asylum because they were faced fear, or people who were possibly trying to create a story and fabricate their way into asylum proceedings. And so the purpose of credible fear interviews is supposed to be, do you have the bare minimum necessary? Are you really truly coming here to seek asylum? And is it likely that the judge in the future will grant that claim? So the first year that we went to Dilley was in 2018, and 96 to 90 something, very high 90s percentages of women and children in Dilley passed these credible fear interviews, because it's supposed to be an easy bar to clear, because that's what Congress intended in 1996 when they passed this law. So with now knowing all of this about the CFI, what it's supposed to do, and the very low bar that it sets, if we return to our example of Anna Maria, before last summer, it's incredibly likely that she would have passed her credible fear interview. She has a clear examples of persecution, being threatened with possible enslavement, sexual assault, possible physical assault or harm to herself or her children. So she meets that persecution bar. She meets membership in a various number of groups, membership with herself and her kids. It's a family. That could be a particular social group. It could also be a claim based on race, because the reason that she is targeted as a woman instead of another woman is because of the color of her skin. So a lot of the work of what we had to do in Dilley is try and connect a woman's story with one of those 5 legal reasons, because you can only get asylum if your fear is because of a protected ground. So since the credible fear interview was such a low bar, it's incredibly likely that she would have passed the CFI before last summer, because there is a significant possibility that sometime in the future she can show that if she were returned to El Salvador, there'd be a 1 in 10 chance that she would be persecuted because of either her race or her membership in either her family or some other type of group in society that society sees as a cohesive group. So passing a CFI is a wonderful thing. It shows that an applicant has some legal basis to her claim. It shows that she's more often than not been deemed credible in presenting her story. It also means that her children automatically also pass their credible fear interviews, so they don't need to sit for an interview with the asylum officer. And her case gets plucked out of this expedited removal path and put into what we call regular 240 proceedings, which is basically the regular court process in immigration court. And that means she'll eventually get to appear in immigration court before an immigration judge and seek asylum. But more importantly than any of those things, at least as it pertains to Dilley, is it more often than not meant that she and her children could be released from detention and could live with friends or family elsewhere in the United States while waiting for her day in immigration court. So passing a credible fear interview in Dilley was incredibly important, because it meant that the women and their children could leave that detention center and travel somewhere else, to maybe to a more populated area, greater access to legal representation, having support network of family, friends, community services, and pro bono services, all of which give her a greater fighting chance for eventually winning that asylum claim in court. So, like I said, the CFI and RFI process is supposed to be this propped open door through which most asylum seekers can easily pass. Like I said, 96% of women passing their credible fear interviews, because that's what it's supposed to do. However, then came last summer with the third country transit ban. And just like a lot of the immigration policies that have been put forward by the Trump administration, it was designed specifically to sort of kick that door closed at the CFI stage. So the third country transit bar, or the TCTB, basically meant that anyone who crosses the southern border of the United States by land cannot apply for asylum in the United States if they didn't first stop and ask for asylum in every country that they passed through. And so there are a few exceptions. One is based on, a very limited, very narrow, very unlikely treaty agreement between the United States and a country that almost never applies. And the second is if the person had been trafficked, subject to human trafficking on their route to the United States. The idea being that if they're being trafficked, they are not in control of their own case and their own agency, and they will be unable to apply for asylum in any of the countries through which they passed through. But again, that exception, incredibly narrow. The broad strokes effect of this policy was that it closed the door on almost all non-Mexican asylum seekers. So basically Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and people from other parts of the world who traveled up through this Central American route to the United States. It did not, however, apply to citizens of Mexico because there is no third country to pass through for Mexican nationals coming to the United States. But most of the women and children that we saw in Dilley were from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So under this third country transit bar, to go back to our example, Anna Maria is in trouble. So since she passed through Guatemala and Mexico on her way to the United States, the asylum officer would like to apply this bar of asylum against her because she admits that she did not apply for asylum in either Guatemala or Mexico on her way to the United States. So this is during the asylum interview, and there is a translator, but once the officer determines that none of the exceptions to this bar apply, he reads her this paragraph that I'll let you read on the screen. And if it makes any sense to you at all, it probably means you're an immigration lawyer or a law student who has taken some familiarity with these topics. But this is the paragraph that women and families heard from the asylum officer, usually about 5 to 10 questions into their interview. And as you can see, I kind of underlined it in this paragraph. Twice the officer tells her, "You are barred from applying for asylum," without explaining the various legal intricacies of what that means. And so imagine being in the position of a woman who more often than not has her children with her in the interview, being read this incredibly dense legal paragraph by a US government official, being told before she even begins to talk about her case, her story, or why she came, that she's not eligible for asylum because she did not apply for asylum on her way to the United States. So if the officer applies that third country bar to her and Anna Maria could not establish one of the exceptions, she received a negative credible fear interview finding, meaning that she can be expeditiously removed back to El Salvador without speaking to a judge, without having a hearing, without ever having a chance to present her full asylum claim. If she gets a negative credible fear interview finding, she can ask an immigration judge to look at it again, but there's no guarantee of the judge changing the decision, especially if she doesn't have access to a lawyer who can make arguments for her on her behalf. So the most likely result of getting a negative credible fear interview is that Anna Maria and her children are all summarily deported without further reasoning or explanation. So what happened when we were at the border last summer was just a purely chaotic mess. The asylum officers didn't know how to apply the transit bar or how to apply its exceptions. So like I explained, one of the exceptions to the third country transit bar is if you've been subjected to human trafficking. But the way the rule was worded, it's not clear if the trafficking has to happen on the way to the United States or in the home country as part of the asylum claim. And so a lot of times what we saw is officers didn't know if they should, when and what types of human trafficking they should be asking about. A second part of the problem was that women who were fleeing domestic violence, the questions to screen them for human trafficking sound a lot like the questions of asking her to present her claim. And so women were getting confused about what she was being asked and what information she should present in order to make her case for asylum. But the bigger and more problematic thing that we saw was that women were just completely confused when confronted with this giant paragraph. And the only thing that they could really hear and understand from this mess is that they were barred from asylum. So more than one woman told us that at that point in the interview, again, this is like 5 to 10 questions into the interview before she even talked about her case, thought that she'd been denied asylum and just gave up and didn't see any point in continuing to tell the asylum officer why she was there. So that's incredibly problematic because it makes it harder to overturn a negative decision and it creates just mass confusion. So when we arrived in Dilley, we arrived 1 week after a national injunction had been put into place to try and stop asylum officers from entering or from applying this rule. But then 2 days before we arrived, that injunction was narrowed in scope to just a specific number of states, which did not include Texas. And we suddenly had to switch back and say, okay, the bar does apply now, and trying to explain to women what that meant and how to best prepare themselves in order not to get kicked out of the assembly line through the CFI process by asylum officers applying this rule. So the assumption that the Trump administration made with the third country transit rule is assuming that people who pass through other countries on the way to the United States can't show a significant possibility that they would be harmed if they return to their home countries. So if you remember, the purpose of the credible fear interview is to open that door as widely as possible so the greatest number of asylum seekers can come in, and you only pull people out of that line if they either have no claim at all or are somehow lying or being fraudulent in their intentions. So the third country transit bar is assuming that if you pass through Guatemala or Mexico and didn't apply for asylum, you must not truly qualify for asylum. But the problem with that is passing through those countries and not qualifying for asylum has nothing to do with, the threats that the women received and whether or not they would be harmed again if returned to their countries. So the third country transit bar, when it's used in the credible fear interview process, just has the effect of kind of yanking the door closed, and instead of letting everybody come in, it's slamming the door on huge chunks of people who should be able to have the basic merits of their claims established. So the main takeaway is that with this CFI and RFI process, the door is supposed to be a very wide door, always open, funneling 96% of asylum seekers through. And like Erin described, in places like Dilley, where there is really not a lot of legal representation, a lot of this is happening away from the eyes of courts and away from the eyes of lawyers. And so the administration has figured out that it can use things like the third country transit ban, like the Remain in Mexico program, like other types of controls and restrictions on asylum seekers. If it can front load those restrictions and put them in the credible fear interview, it can slam the door shut on asylum seekers before they ever get near a court, a lawyer, or any type of honestly real civilization in order to be protected. And so I wanted to sort of tie all of this together and sort of really try and illustrate how the credible fear process is being used in a way that Congress never intended, and is being used as a way to actually implement these procedures and build this sort of policy wall on the border that really makes a physical wall at this point completely unnecessary, because nobody can come in, everybody is stuck in Mexico, and this is kind of where we are, because the administration unfortunately has learned how to use this CFI mechanism to really close off asylum to large numbers of people. So I know that was a lot of information, so if there's any questions afterwards, I think, if we have time, we can talk about them. If not, people feel free to reach out. But I think I'll turn it over to Perla now, who will talk more specifically about our work and the impact it had. If I can figure out how to get out of here.
Okay, there it is. Hi, everyone. Just give me some time so that I can share my screen too. Give me one moment. Here it is. Share. Okay, everybody sees that? Yes. Awesome. Let me put it as a PowerPoint really fast. Okay, so hi again. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Well, my name is Perla Rubio. I come actually from El Paso, Texas, a border city. And I also recently graduated from UW Law in May of 2020. And I'm currently in the Immigrant Justice Clinic with Erin. It's impossible to leave. I just love the work that we do in the Immigrant Justice Clinic, love the students, and love all of the people that are so passionate about immigration along with me. So I'm going to speak a little bit about all of the volunteer opportunities and the work that we did as volunteers on the ground in Dilley. And I'm also going to explain a little bit and share with you guys my experience in the detention facility. So here I go. So volunteers work. First of all, I just list a number of things that we did. Orientation, charlas, we did also intake forms, T20As, we did individual interviews, one-on-one interviews with the families detained, we did mock credible fear interviews, we did reviews of negatives, helped with the reviews of negatives, and a lot of other administrative work. So first of all, I want to talk about orientation. So the beautiful thing about volunteering it was before the Cara Pro Bono project, but right now I think it's the Proyecto Dilley. They changed the name. So the beautiful thing about it is that it doesn't require you to have a lot of immigration experience or any immigration experience, because they provide you with the training, the orientation. So a day prior, you have to arrive on a Sunday, and then that afternoon, you go into a hotel, a room reserved, specifically so that they provide you with the training. It's about 4 to 6 hours, and it's mostly about the asylum process. And honestly, it looks like what Julia and Angela just did. You sit down and then you listen to Julia speak about what's asylum, how is that process, what does the families have to prove. So yeah, and then you also actually, we also speak about what a credible fear interview is, and Angela did a beautiful job of explaining it so specific, and that's what they do. They provide you with also samples, which she did also beautifully. She provided a hypothetical, and then they also provide a bunch of questions and allow you to also ask questions. And I included a piece of information that they included in one of those PowerPoints that really helped me when I went there. And they asked us, what is my job here? And I would like to read it to you guys. I know you're seeing it in the screen. So it's to meet with women to prepare them for their interviews, to figure out which part of their stories are most important for their asylum claim. Help the women understand what kinds of questions the asylum office is going to ask them, and what are the specific details that could make or break their case. We call this conversation a CFI prep, a preparation for the credible fear interviews, and our goal was to get every single woman in Dilley a positive. And that was so empowering for me, because that really put in my mind what I was really there to do and had a goal in mind. So whatever I did, that was going to be my goal. Next. So the very first things, or the very first step into going on the ground, I'm going to put a parenthesis here because it's important for me to explain. So before 2017, volunteers or even the administrators of the Cara Pro Bono project were not allowed inside of the detention facility, or unless they had a very specific purpose to go there, either to accompany one of these women to their credible fear interviews or to meet one-on-one with them because an issue or something that happened in their interview with the asylum officer. So once in 2018, and because the Cara Pro Bono project did an amazing job in helping so many women. They gained their access to the detention facility, but only to a very small part of the detention facility. And the detention facility is divided in different trailers. And the Cara Pro Bono project can only access one of those trailers, the volunteers. And I'm going to explain later because it's a little bit complicated, but we were just in one trailer. And once we had to go there in the morning. So the very first things that we would do is an intake charla. And what the intake charla was, just introduce the Dilley Pro Bono project, welcome the women to the US, and just explain the purpose of why we were there, who we were, and our purpose with them. And then after that, we would sit the women and children and help them fill out some paperwork. And I'm going to explain that later on. But that was the very first thing. Every time we did an intake charla, it was mostly because the women and children had just recently arrived or had a day or two. So we would literally see the women like right after they would arrive to the United States or got detained, right? Or they had just one day or two sometimes. So, and then after, after we did the intake charla, then they would usually leave. We would just let them know to wait for their, so there was a paper called the G56 that the officers was supposed to give to them, which had the date and time of their credible fear interview. So we would let them know that, you know what, you're gonna receive this paperwork. As soon as you get it, come to us. Or you know what, or most of the time we would tell them, okay, today you're gonna go back. If the asylum or if an officer gives you this form, come back with us. If not, come back tomorrow. So the Cara Pro Bono project tried to see the women and children every single day before their credible fear interview. So that was the intake charla. And then as the second day, usually when the women would come back with their paper where it said it had the time for their credible fear interview, we would now prepare them or give them a general idea of what asylum is in the United States. Because let's remember, I mean, they are from other countries. They've never been into the United States. They don't know our laws. Even for us, it's like really hard and complicated to understand what asylum is. So we would just give them a general idea and explanation of what asylum was. And it was important for us in that moment to let them know that, hey, we're not with ICE. We don't agree with what they're doing. We're here for you. We're here to help you. So at every moment, either in the intake charla or the prep charla, it was a moment to empower these women and to let them know that, hey, what you're doing is not illegal. What you're doing is not wrong. So that's why we're helping you, because we don't agree with how the government is treating this. And then at the end, once they had the critical fear interview, then we will ask them to come back to give them an exit charla, in which we usually, depending on the state where they were going to go, we would, well, not us, the volunteers usually, but I did help in one case to arrange flights with their family members. So what we would do is help the family, the women and children, contact their sponsor or a family member in the US, or somebody that was going to help them travel to the state where they were going to go. And then also in 2018, the very first year that we went, we saw a lot of reunifications of families. It was beautiful and wonderful. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. This is just a small summary. I don't want to take a lot of time because I know it's about to end. So, okay, the intake forms, I already explained to you. After the intake charla, you would sit the woman around the table and help them fill out the intake forms. And this was so special, guys, because we saw that many women didn't know how to read or write. And it was just so important to have a volunteer there, because imagine if nobody was there, like they would literally turn it just as it is. And then the G28, it was also important for the Cara Pro Bono project to make sure that the woman would sign. That way they granted access, or they granted the Cara Pro Bono project the right to speak on their behalf or to file papers on their behalf. Next, really fast. Okay, so individual interviews. This was the purpose of going and volunteering. This was like what we mostly did, most of us, which was to, right after the prep charla that I mentioned you, we would we had a list, or they had to sign in a list for one of the volunteers to meet one-on-one with each of these women and their children. In 2018, we honestly met with only the women and would try to ask the mothers to can you please take your child to a very specific, they had a very, like a small room where they had a TV and the kids could go there to watch TV. So we would ask them, please, can you, is it possible that you leave your children there? Because I mean, I know that what you're gonna talk about, you might not feel comfortable talking about it in front of your children. So, but in 2019, the second time we went, unfortunately, we also had to speak with the children about it. And I'm going to explain a little bit about it later on. But once we did the pre-charla, then the women would stay there waiting for a volunteer to call their name. And then a volunteer would get the women and get into a small room in the trailer where we were. It had several individual rooms with a desk, some chairs, and then a phone. And so that was beautiful about it, that you didn't have to speak Spanish. There was a language line that you could call, that they provided you with a translator that you could communicate with the women. So it was hard. It was a very hard moment, because the Cara Pro Bono project only told us to meet with them about 45 minutes, but it was just so impossible. We had to hear their stories. It was so much content. And what's important about the individual interviews is that at any moment, we never told the women what to say. We only listened. And our purpose was only to help them connect. And I loved how Julia and Angie mentioned it, to connect their story, help them connect their story to one of those 5 protected grounds. So. And then, and also the Cara Pro Bono project provides you with a handbook, provides you with, it never leaves you just like that. They provided you with also a list of sample questions that you could maybe got stuck, got nervous, and you just like, you can always refer back to it and follow it. Okay, so I wanna talk about trauma. When you would listen to the stories, honestly, I hate this picture, but I love it because it's a really representation of how the women look in Dilley and the kids, because they're together in the detention center, women and children. And you would talk to them and this is how they looked. They sometimes wouldn't even look at you in the eyes because of how ugly their experiences was. And also we were strangers. Many of their stories, for them, they felt ashamed, they felt embarrassed, or it was just too traumatic for them to even speak about it. And it was just, for me, it was shocking when I met with the women individually and I had to look at this. And then obviously, due to family separations and all of the ugly things that were going on, the mothers were like this with their children. They didn't want to leave their children. And remember what I told you before, that we would ask the women if they could please like take their child to this room to watch TV, because they were going to hear, right, the story, and we didn't want the mother to feel uncomfortable. but they didn't want to separate. They were so scared. So we really had to be repetitive, and we really had to be constant in letting them know that, hey, remember, we're here for you. We're not eyes. There's a lot of volunteers around. Don't worry. It was just, man, it was emotionally and mentally exhausting. So that's when we would listen to their stories and allow them to really, I don't know how to say it, but I just allowed them to tell their story to somebody and tell their story to somebody that believes in them. That, you know what, we believe in your story. We know that this happened. Then that's when we would try to ask them those questions and try to do like a mock credible fear interview. And we emphasize the importance of telling their story in a chronological order. And it was difficult because they have gone through very traumatic experiences. And when you go through trauma, sometimes you start just saying things and you don't even know when it happened, how it happened. And then, so we really try to work hard with the woman to be like, you know what, unfortunately, if we don't agree with how they do things, but in the US, there's something about telling your story in chronological order that allows the officer to kind of like imagine what you went through and be there in a sense with you through the process or through the experience that you went through. And also because it's so important that you let the officer know of every detail that happened, because every detail is so important. But many of the women were not able to do that. They were really sad, or they were really traumatized by their experience. So we would tell them to, if they weren't able to do that, that was okay. They didn't have to. Then just to make sure that they would tell the asylum officers the very first time that they were harmed, the worst time that they were harmed, and the last time that they were harmed before coming to the United States. And this really helped the women because they at least had a sense of what to expect when going to their interview with the asylum officers. Because even though we prepared them, they got super nervous. I mean, I would imagine like putting myself in their shoes, and I would be super nervous as well. And then this particularly helped with the women that were not able to come to the pro bono project, to the trailer where the volunteers were, even before, like a day prior to their credible fear interview. So sometimes they would come like 15 minutes before their interview. So this was good when we would sit down, okay, let's pretend I'm the officer. These are the type of questions that they're going to ask you. Okay, let's do it. And then unfortunately in 2019, we also had to interview children. I mean, not going to very much detail, but ask questions to also the children. And then I mentioned the language line, so that it was an amazing resource for individuals that weren't bilingual. And also, we were in those moments when the person maybe because of how stressed they were not able to remember, or they were like, I don't know, like I just know that it was a guy that was following me, but the one that knows is my mom. So we were able to, okay, can you contact your mom? Is it possible to contact your mom? So we were able to also speak to family members in their home country, and the Care Pro Bono Project provided us with codes, country codes. Okay, and then this happened not in 2018, the very first time that we volunteered, but the second time we volunteered. As Angela mentioned, many were receiving negative credible fear determinations due to the third country bar. And so it was horrible, because not only did they have to experience one time going to an officer, completely stranger, telling their most vulnerable experience, traumatic experience, but then they had to do it maybe a second time, now with more information. And like Angela said, I mean, the credible fear interview was to only be like very low burden, very low bar, and it was not happening. So we were, as volunteers, we were able to help with all of the women that were receiving these negatives. So we did not file any form, but what we did was to help write affidavits, gather also other types of resources like articles or any other supporting evidence that would establish that, hey, our client, because they did file G28, our client, their story is legit, their story does meet this burden. So we would meet again, we would meet again several times, actually more than twice, with the women that received negatives, so that we would be able to write affidavits, ask more details. And it was so frustrating at this moment, because it was like, really, it was like fighting an asylum case when it was like barely the first stage. It was so exhausting. It was just so exhausting. But it was also very encouraging, because you kind of wanted to fight back and be like, no, like, this is not okay. And I have so much information, but other administrative work we did was do some scanning, uploading what they call batching, which is a process that they're explained in detail there, filing. Some of the volunteers did an interview accompaniment. That was not very frequent, but some of them they did, depending on the woman's need. We did advocacy emails, locating separated adults, locating separated children, because we were only with family and children, women and children, I'm sorry, which meant that men, they got separated. If the whole family came, dad, mom, and child, only mom and child were together. That was, women didn't know. That's why it was important for us to locate and try to reunite the family, and then copying as well. So my experience as a volunteer, like I told you before, it was a really rewarding experience, an amazing experience. I'm never gonna forget it. And most importantly, it was like a very amazing legal experience, in the sense, because I knew what was actually happening on the ground. Like, nobody told me, I didn't read it, I saw it. And now, like, I knew how the process would work at first, and I was able to go back to the Immigrant Justice Clinic and now have a better understanding of where the case was at that moment. And I know that it ends at 5:30, right, Erin? Oh, I'm so sorry. I know. So, I mean, I can talk about it, but it's a matter of time.
I think we can extend it a little bit, because this is so precious and so important, that we should let you finish.
Okay, thank you. I just didn't want to extend more than I needed to. So I'm rushing through this because it's like a lot of information, a lot of work, and it's just, honestly, you have to volunteer in order for you to really know. But security, we did have to pass through metal detector. We were not allowed to have our phones there. I didn't take any personal bags, because honestly, you couldn't take anything in there, no lotions, no makeup, no coloring books, no hand sanitizer, anything. And they really recommended us to actually carry transparent bags where they can see everything. If not, we had to take everything out of our bags and then put it back in. And then dress code, it was business casual. Dresses had to be longer. Dresses or skirts had to be longer than the knees. And then it was recommended to wear comfortable shoes, because we were running up and down. I know that we were, for the most part, sitting down because of the interviews, but it was like, I need your help here. I need your help here. It was just, and so, like I mentioned to you, the detention is divided into different portables. We were just in one. And we had to be, if we had to go, let's say, accompany a woman to the credible fear interview, we did have to be escorted. Anywhere we would go, like beyond that trailer, we had to be escorted by an officer. So Dilley conditions. So Dilley is in Texas, and Texas is extremely hot, super hot. But inside the trailer where the women and children where we were, it was so cold, so cold. And both of the years that I went, I got sick because like how drastic the change in the climate or in the weather was. And so, and also the water, we had to take our own water because the water in Dilley is contaminated. And because Dilley is a very small town with its main, I guess, resource is fracking oil. And then also the detention center is like so far away in a very isolated area. And like, even when we as volunteers, it was our time to go from the hotel to the detention facility, we passed it because it was like, what, where is it? If they didn't have a sign there, we honestly could have missed it. And I know that now the sign is no longer there. They had to pull it back. I don't know if they put it back in front again, but it's in a very rural area. We're far away from resources, far away from nonprofit organizations like Prayer Pro Bono Project. That's why it was so important. It's so important, the amazing work that they do, because everything that they do matters and has a very significant positive impact in their asylum process. And so also, I want to mention and note something that the children at the detention facility, they were all sick, all of the children there. So that's why it was important for us to note when kids were sick or if they had any type of medical issues, because of that same reason. Like, outside is super cold. Outside is super hot, inside is super cold. And then it's divided in trailers. They have to go outside so that they can transfer to another trailer. So if they're gonna go from, let's say, from their room to the cafeteria, they have to go outside. So those changes in temperatures, it was horrible. And then the Prayer Pro Bono Project did had obviously paper, right? And some crayons, not a lot, but oh my gosh, that was also like a whole drama with the officers, because we had to ask the officers every time we wanted to give crayons to the children. I was like, really? Like, come on, they're children. You want them to sit down and be like, okay, yay. And then every time a child was like screaming or wanting to play, the officers were so rude. Shut up, or where's the mom of this child? Oh my God, it was like so frustrating because we want to kind of like to scream to the officer, right? You kind of want to advocate for the women, but then you also know that the Prayer Pro Bono Project fought to gain their place there, and you don't want to mess with that because it's so important for them to be inside. So it was just like so complicated, and we had to remain our cool, and we have to be nice and polite and ask for crayons for the kids and paper. Okay. Now trauma and secondary trauma. I've never experienced secondary trauma, but when I went there, that was the first time I experienced secondary trauma because of the same reason. Like, all of the stories that you hear, none of the stories that I heard were like, no, they were like, their stories were so full of violent events. It was just so sad. And me as a woman, I could have never imagined like going through the experiences that they went through. And it was just like, it was horrible. But then at the same time, when I came back from the trip, I meditated about it, and I was like, you know what, like, that's why a lot of people maybe don't want to do this. And that's why a lot of people like it's just really hard for them to take the time to even go and volunteer because it's just so traumatic. But who else will it, like, I don't know. I felt that I needed to do it, and there was a purpose why I did it, and I want to continue doing it because the women there need to have a voice outside, and people need to know that this is happening. This is not like some drama or makeup story. It's like for real. This is real. And so we did cry a lot, to be honest, in Dilley. But at the same time, like, we empowered each other, we encouraged each other, and it was just so amazing to go in a group because we kind of, at night, we would gather together and we were like, oh, can we talk about it? And just uplift each other even through this horrible, difficult experience. But also what was amazing to see, even though like you see all these horrible things, you hear the stories of these women, it was also hopeful to hear or to see the impact that the Cara Pro Bono project has, like how important it is to explain to the woman what asylum is, like that they feel that they're not alone, that they feel that now they're prepared, now they know what to expect. And that's why they were able to have so many positives in the Credible Fear interviews, because now they know, oh, okay, now I know that this part of my story matters, that this part of my story is not, like, it matters in the law too. And it's not just like something that doesn't matter. Give me just a moment. Okay. And I want to end with a good note that it was like amazing to see that even though these women have gone through this horrible experience, not only in their home country, but also through their journey to the US, they were like super brave. They were not ashamed, and they told us their story. They were so hopeful. They were like, no, but I know here I'm going to be secure. I know, and I believe in the US. And we were like, oh my gosh. Like, they were strong, they were smart, and most importantly, they were resilient. And I think that's what kept me going in Dilley, because I was just like, this is so exhausting, because the shifts were like from 10 to 12 hours a day, Monday to Friday. But just seeing this woman and the attitude and how strong they were for the children, I was like, I can't give up. Like, I need to keep helping. And I need to keep telling the stories of these women so that they know and they can also continue the fight towards this broken immigration system. So I think that's what I'm going to end, because I want to give the opportunity also to other volunteers that went to speak about their beautiful experience. Let me see if I can stop sharing. Just a moment. Okay, there you go.
Thank you so much. Kata, do you think it's a good time to end, or should we keep going a little bit?
I think that we can extend it 15 minutes for questions, because this is, I'm sure that we still have quite a bit of public with us hanging on, probably eager to ask questions. I know these are things that we can't find out about from many other sources. So thank you so much for these wonderful presentations, and let's attend the questions.
Okay, let's see if there are any questions. I'm not seeing any questions right now, but did any of the other volunteers want to share? Oh, maybe here's one. Can anybody see that question? Oh, here we go. Almita, oh, okay, so Robert Castro asks, will the webinar be available? I think it's immediately available to review. And then Almita Miranda asks, how has the pandemic affected your volunteer work? Does anybody want to explain that, or should I? I can probably go through it a little bit. So we plan to continue doing these experiential learning trips as soon as travel is safe. The program will continue to go to Dilley, as well as we started to go to Tijuana, where last week Nicole Ramos was on the panel for this series, and she is the director of the program. So we'll continue to do that, but right now all of our volunteer work is remote. So we're doing mostly work here remotely in Wisconsin, and then hopefully we'll be able to do more in the future when it becomes safe for students to travel. And then the last question, is there going to be a trip to Dilley this year with COVID? Probably not this year, but hopefully next year. I mean, I say hopefully, I hope there isn't, because the Family Detention Center will no longer be needed, because we'll allow people who pass their women and children to not being in detention in the United States. But if it still exists, that we will probably continue to go, as these students are incredible, and they have the energy and the skill and the heart to really, quite frankly, save people's lives and ensure that due process is offered to so many people. So do any of you other, like May or Ramuel or Naomi or Juan Jose, do you have anything else you want to share that we didn't really hit on?
I mean, Perla did kind of hit on everything, but I think, like, just to kind of echo some of the stuff she said, for me, it was really interesting to see how the specific trauma that these women had experienced made it difficult for them to talk about what had happened to them, which was the most important thing that they needed to say. So it was really hard to be in a situation where you couldn't change things or make things easier. Like, I remember having women with 1.5-year-olds and 1-year-olds crying, and their moms are saying, this kid needs a pacifier so we can keep talking, but that just wasn't an option. So I don't know, bearing all that in mind, and also just the difficulty of feeling like you're having this test with an asylum officer and all the anxieties that go with that, and how hard this process is.
Would anybody else like to share, or Juan Jose or Ramuel? I don't know if Naomi's still here.
I can go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So people have already touched on this, and to make it maybe a little bit political, what I got out of it is that whoever says that coming in through the southern border is the easy way to come to the U.S., they really don't know what they're talking about, because as Angela and Julia talk about, the trip is just so difficult, and I personally cannot imagine what has to be happening in my life to really just pack a backpack, grab my children, and go to a country you've never been before, giving literally your livelihood and trusting people you've never met before, and ultimately getting to a place that you don't even speak the language. And the sad part is that when you get there, then you are detained. And I don't think we talked about this, but before they get to Dilley, they go through other detention centers that are nicknamed La Hielera and La Perrera, Icebox, and the Doghouse, just to give you an idea of what the conditions are there. And that also, I also got a lot out of our impact there. We are the first friendly person that actually wants to hear the story, because we want to hear the story, not because we have to and are part of a government process. So the impact that individuals who volunteer there is enormous, and I definitely encourage everyone who has the opportunity.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on just the dehumanization of this entire process. Like, I think I accompanied a woman and a mother and her 6-year-old to an interview, and the asylum officer was interviewing the 6-year-old, and I mean, they were asking questions like, are you scared to go to your country? Do you fear persecution? And I mean, the 6-year-old just had no idea what was going on. And it's just ridiculous that they're even, first of all, just interviewing these 6-year-olds and talking to them like that. And I think it just hits home, like the process and how they're just not really treated like human beings, and they're just not afforded any rights. And that just really stuck to me, how they're treating these children and these mothers down there.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful and just so true of the treatment. We've dehumanized and criminalized the process of seeking refuge in our country. I think we all saw that firsthand. There are a few questions about people asking of how they can get involved either as an undergrad or just how people can get involved in the community. And you guys have all found a way. So I don't know if any of you want to share how you got involved or what suggestions you have.
I guess I can say the number one thing is, don't be shy and afraid of reaching out to places in the community. Like, it's easy to Google, immigration nonprofits. If you're in the Madison area, you can reach out to any of us or to Erin, and we can connect you with places that are Madison specific. There's also a lot of places in Milwaukee, but it's also, just being creative. If you speak a foreign language or a second or third language, offering to connect with people to help with translating documents can be helpful, and just really not being afraid to approach and ask someone what you can do to help, because that's how I got started in all of this, was just cold calling an immigration law firm in Milwaukee that was down the street from my house, and she needed an assistant, and it just happened to work out and connect and set me on this path. So I recognize that it can be intimidating, especially if you don't know anything, and that imposter syndrome can feel crushing, but a lot of people who are out here doing this work are really passionate about it and really excited when someone else, especially someone new, wants to get involved. So don't be afraid, and don't be afraid to ask questions and find those resources.
It's worth noting that that's also the exact same way I got involved in immigration work in the first part. I was an undergrad, and I just Googled Spanish-speaking volunteer opportunities in St. Louis, which is where I went to undergrad, and came up with a random immigration nonprofit and sent them my resume, and they were like, cool, when can you start? So, there's opportunities, even if you're an undergraduate, to get involved. And definitely, like Angela said, taking that first step and just reaching out and seeing if an organization needs help in any way, it can definitely be the quickest way perhaps to get involved.
Maybe we'll do one more question. Someone asked, or Will Baynard asked, if Trump is not reelected, what changes would you expect in the asylum process? Does anybody have a comment? I can comment, but I'd rather hear from any of you.
Well, I think the third country transit bar would probably be a thing of the past. Right now, I think it's currently vacated, but that's being appealed, so we don't know where that's going to end up. But the whole thing is an interim rule to begin with anyway, and is administrative. So if there's not an administration pushing for it, it will probably go away, and that on its own would make such a huge difference.
The Trump administration issued regulations just this summer modifying the credible fear interview, and those changes increasingly, as Angela talked about, increasingly make the CFI pretty much the whole asylum process, summarized into just an interview. So hopefully we would expect that with another president, that regulation would be rolled back, and the CFI would be back to be what it's supposed to be. It's just a very low bar, screening only the most outrageous and clearly false claims, and allowing asylum seekers to continue the asylum process in the U.S.
I think I would only add also that, family detention, these detention centers or residential centers really got restarted under Obama. And so I'm not anticipating that they will necessarily go away. I'm hoping that they will. But I think what we learned about when zero tolerance happened in family separation, why that stopped is really the power of the people. And so if you hear something, if you see something that's wrong, if you see our country violating people's human rights, it's time to speak up and it's time to fight against it, because that's the only way we're going to be able to end this. Detaining people does not discourage people fleeing their countries from refuge. from persecution in seeking refuge. And that's just all the information shows that we know that as a country. And so we don't need to treat women and children in an inhumane way for no reason at all. So I think it really is the power of the people that's going to make these changes that will make our country a more humane place for people living here as well as people who are seeking refuge. So I think that's probably how we can close.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who participated in this powerful panel. Thank you so much for doing this work. We're really proud to be able to host such a great quality panel in our migration webinar series here in LACIS and CLACS. And thanks to the public who stayed until the last moment, and thanks to Erin for doing such a great organizing.
No, thank you to if you're ever looking for someone to admire in this world, look at these students, because they are, while in school, they're still using their time, their free time to make the lives of others better. And I think that that's just so powerful these days. So I'm grateful for each and every one of them, and also for everybody who listened today to know what's really going on in our country.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
See you next week.